There is a version of MMA history where Demetrious Johnson is mentioned in the same breath as any of the all-time greats the sport has ever produced, without any hesitation, without any debate whatsoever. He broke the record for the most consecutive UFC title defenses in history. He did it against real, dangerous opposition. He finished fights with technique that left experienced fight fans genuinely stunned. He was, by nearly every technical measure, one of the most complete mixed martial artists the sport has ever seen. And yet, for much of his run, a significant portion of the casual MMA audience barely even knew his name. Now, that contrast between what he actually was inside the cage and how much credit the wider world gave him for it is one of the most fascinating stories the sport has to tell. Now, this is the full story of Demetrious Johnson. Demetrious Johnson was born on August 13, 1986 in Madisonville, Kentucky, but he grew up in Washington State in the Parkland area near Tacoma. His upbringing was not the kind that produces a lot of professional athletes. He came from a difficult background, the kind where stability was not guaranteed and where the path forward was not laid out clearly for him. What he found, relatively late compared to many elite athletes, was wrestling. He started wrestling in high school, which is not particularly unusual, but what is notable is that he was not a heavily recruited standout coming out of it. He was not the guy with multiple Division I scholarship offers and a decorated amateur career. He was a kid who discovered he was good at something physical and competitive and started pursuing it seriously. That detail matters because it tells you something about how his entire career was going to go. He was not going to be handed anything. Everything he got, he was going to have to figure out and earn. After high school, he started training in mixed martial arts, finding his way into the sport through the Pacific Northwest regional scene. He was small, even by the standards of the lighter weight classes, standing 5 feet 3 inches tall, and that physical reality immediately defined some of the challenges and some of the advantages that would shape his career. He was fast, he was athletic relative to his size, and he had a natural intelligence in athletic situations that started showing up the moment he began competing seriously. His regional record was impressive enough that he got noticed by the World Extreme Cage Fighting, which at the time was a UFC affiliated promotion that ran the lighter weight classes, where fighters like him could actually compete against opponents closer to their own size. The company was a legitimate platform that produced serious fighters, and making it there was a meaningful step up from the regional scene. Demetrious Johnson made that step, and once he got there, it became clear relatively quickly that he was not going to be a regional level fighter who faded out when the competition got serious. He was going to be exactly the opposite of that. When the WEC merged into the UFC in late 2010, several fighters from that roster came over to compete at the highest level of the sport. Now, Demetrious Johnson was among them, and he came in as a bantamweight competing at 135 pounds. He was young, he was relatively unproven against elite opposition, and still building out his complete game. The test that came to define this early phase of his UFC career was a fight for the Bantamweight Championship against Dominick Cruz at UFC 132 in June 2011. Cruz was one of the most technically difficult fighters in the entire sport at that time. His movement, his footwork, his ability to make opponents miss and then counter with clean shots was genuinely elite and genuinely hard to solve for most people who stepped in front of him. Johnson was not ready for him at that point. Cruz won by unanimous decision, and the loss was clear enough that there was not much debate about the outcome. That experience against Cruz was important though, not because it ended Johnson, which it very clearly did not, but because it showed him exactly what the ceiling of elite competition looked like and gave him something to measure himself against. The fighters who learn from those kinds of losses tend to come back different. Demetrious Johnson came back as a different fighter. He moved down to 125 pounds when the company created the flyweight division, and and that decision immediately made sense from a physical standpoint. At bantamweight, he was always on the smaller end. At flyweight, he was competing against men whose size and physical attributes were much closer to his own, and suddenly the speed, the athleticism, and the intelligence that had always been there were operating in an environment where they could fully express themselves. To determine who would become the inaugural flyweight champion, the promotion ran a short tournament. Johnson fought Ian McCall in the first round, and the fight ended in a majority draw. They ran it back, and in the rematch, Johnson won clearly. Then he faced Joseph Benavidez for the inaugural flyweight title at UFC 152 in September 2012. Benavidez was a legitimate, experienced, well-rounded fighter who had also competed at bantamweight before dropping to flyweight. The fight was competitive and Johnson won by unanimous decision. Demetrious Johnson, the kid from Madisonville who had not been heavily recruited out of high school and who had lost his first title fight against Dominic Cruz the year before, was now the flyweight champion. He was 25 years old and had just become the first person in history to hold that title. What followed that night is the part of his story that gets harder and harder to properly explain to anyone who never watched it unfold. Then the title defenses started, and they just kept coming, and then they kept coming after that. One of the first serious tests of his reign came from John Dodson, who had won the Ultimate Fighter as a flyweight and possessed genuinely scary knockout power for a 125-pound fighter. Dodson was fast, he was dangerous, and he was the kind of fighter who could legitimately threaten anyone in the division, because one clean shot from him could end your entire evening. Now, Johnson controlled that fight with a combination of footwork, timing, and takedown threat, and it's the kind that neutralized Dodson's most dangerous weapon. He won by unanimous decision, and he made it look cleaner than it had any right to be against that level of punching power. Defense after defense followed. Joseph Benavidez got a rematch and lost again. Ali Bagautinov was handled. Kyoji Horiguchi, who would go on to become a world champion in his own right in multiple organizations, came in as a serious threat and lost a decision. Every single time Johnson stepped in front of a credible opponent, something similar happened. The challenger would come in with a specific game plan, with a specific physical advantage or technical skill they planned to use, and Johnson would identify it, neutralize it, and then find ways to score from positions his opponent did not even see developing. That last part is what separated him from almost everyone in the sport at any weight class. His ability to be in a fight, read what was happening in real time, and adjust within the flow of an exchange was genuinely elite. He could chain strikes to takedowns to submission attempts in combinations that made it feel like he was always operating several moves ahead of whoever was in front of him. Hardcore fans who watch MMA with a serious eye were watching Johnson's title defenses and having very real conversations about whether they were watching one of the greatest fighters on the planet. Those conversations kept building, and then there was the night at UFC 216 in October 2017. Ray Borg was the challenger, and this was the defense that could break the record. Anderson Silva had made 10 consecutive UFC title defenses over his legendary middleweight run. Johnson needed to match it first and then beat it. He won the fight, and then in the 5th round, with the record already within reach, he did something that fight fans still reference when they talk about the most technically stunning finishes in MMA history. He jumped into the air and secured a flying armbar on the ground from a scramble in the 5th round of a championship fight, while chasing an all-time record. Ray Borg tapped immediately, and Demetrious Johnson had done something no fighter in the UFC had ever done. 11 consecutive title defenses, breaking the record that many people thought would stand indefinitely. That moment should have been one of the biggest celebrations in the history of the sport. There should have been wall-to-wall coverage, retrospectives running across every major outlet, and a genuine mainstream conversation about where this man stood among the all-time greats. What actually happened was considerably quieter than that. The reaction from the hardcore community was massive. The reaction from the broader public was a fraction of what it would have been for a fighter competing at a higher weight class or carrying a more marketable personality. That gap between what Johnson did that night and how much noise it made is the central tension of his entire story. The criticisms of Demetrious Johnson were never really about his skill. Almost nobody who watched him fight seriously tried to argue that he was not excellent at his job. The criticisms were always about drawing power, star quality, and the commercial side of what it means to be a champion in MMA. The flyweight division has always struggled to generate mainstream interest. 125 pounds is the lightest weight class in the UFC, and a portion of the MMA fan base has always engaged less with lighter fighters, regardless of how technically brilliant those fighters are. The knockouts at flyweight look different from the knockouts at heavyweight. The raw physical violence that casual fans respond to most immediately is less apparent at 125, even when the technical quality of the fighting is superior to what you might see in heavier divisions. That is just the reality of how a portion of the audience engages with combat sports, and it is not really something any individual fighter can fully overcome regardless of their skill level. Johnson also did not have the kind of personality that generates mainstream headlines outside of fight week. He was not trash talking, not building feuds for the cameras, not driving narrative cycles between events. He was thoughtful, self-aware, known among people who followed him closely for being a genuine person with real interests outside of fighting, including a well-documented love of video games. But none of that translates into the kind of publicity machine that turns a champion into a household name. There is also a fair version of the argument that his style, while technically superior, was not always the most exciting to watch for a general audience. Some of his decision wins were dominant but not dramatic.
Mighty Mouse Johnson!
Dominance and drama are different things, and the fights where he controlled opponents methodically from the first round to the last were winning him the title defenses without always producing the kind of moments that casual fans clip and share and remember years later. The flying armbar was the exception. A lot of his wins were not that. All of that said, the record was the record, and the skill was the skill, and the losses on his resume were limited and against credible opponents. He was what he was, regardless of how many PPV buys his fights generated. Then came Henry Cejudo at UFC 227 in August 2018. Their first fight had gone to Johnson relatively clearly in most people's assessments, though Cejudo had been competitive and had shown significant improvement from his earlier attempts to crack the flyweight elite. The rematch was close, genuinely close, and when the scorecards came in, giving it to Cejudo by split decision, the reaction was split as well. A meaningful portion of people watching believed Johnson had done enough to win, and the scoring felt tight enough that the outcome could have gone either direction. Cejudo became champion. The 11 defense run was over. What happened next was genuinely unprecedented in MMA. The UFC and One Championship, the major Asian MMA organization, completed a trade. Demetrious Johnson went to One Championship. Ben Askren came to the UFC. Fighters being traded between promotions like professional athletes in a team sport had simply never happened in MMA before. The fact that it happened here with Johnson as the centerpiece was remarkable regardless of how you interpreted the reasons behind it. Reports at the time indicated that Johnson had not been enthusiastic about an immediate third fight with Cejudo, preferring to move up in weight or pursue other options within the UFC. The UFC, for their part, was willing willing to make the trade. Whether you read that situation as the UFC undervaluing a historic champion or as a legitimate disagreement about the direction of his career depends on how you weigh the available information, and the full picture is complicated enough that clean takes in either direction probably miss something.
See right there that Adriano threw that low leg kick, but he paid for it.
Johnson landed in one championship and kept competing. He won the one flyweight world championship by defeating Geje Eustaquio. He then competed in the one flyweight world Grand Prix, going through multiple rounds of competition to win the entire tournament by beating Danny Kingad in the final. Whatever questions had surrounded his exit from the UFC, he answered them in a straightforward way inside the cage, by continuing to perform at a very high level in a new environment against new opponents. Now here's the honest full picture of what Demetrious Johnson built. He came from circumstances that did not suggest a world-class athletic career was coming. He lost his first UFC title shot to Dominic Cruz, and he used it as a learning experience rather than a ceiling. He became the first UFC flyweight champion, and then he set an all-time record for consecutive title defenses in the organization's history. 11 straight defenses against a wide range of different and genuinely dangerous opponents who came at him with every kind of physical and technical threat that the division had to offer. He produced the most technically accomplished flyweight performance in UFC history on multiple occasions. He won the one flyweight championship and the one Grand Prix after leaving the UFC, proving his competitive level held up in a completely new environment. His record of losses is short and contains genuinely defensible results. A loss to one of the sport's elite movers in Cruz, and a split decision against a significantly improved Cejudo in a fight that a large portion of informed observers scored for Johnson. The case for putting him in the conversation about the greatest fighters in MMA history is not a weak one. 11 consecutive title defenses, technical mastery across striking, wrestling, and submissions, the ability to adapt and solve problems in real time that almost no fighter at any weight class could match during his prime, a career that extended across multiple eras of the sport without a significant decline in competitive level. The honest case against the absolute top tier of that conversation involves the weight class question, which is genuine, and the Cejudo loss, which stands on the record regardless of how it was scored by various observers. There is also the uncomfortable reality that his departure from the UFC under contested circumstances left his story with a slightly messy ending to a chapter that deserved a cleaner one. But the thing that makes his career so interesting as a subject is precisely the contrast that runs through all of it. He did extraordinary things in his sport, documented on film, verifiable on scorecards and finish records and statistical measures. He broke a record that was thought to be nearly untouchable, and he did all of it while operating in a weight class and with a personality that the mainstream MMA conversation consistently treated as secondary. The sport does not give everyone the same platform. Weight classes matter commercially. Personality and marketability matter commercially. Those things are real, but they are not a fair measure of what a fighter is. And in Demetrious Johnson's case, they consistently obscured a competitor who deserved to be right at the center of the all-time great discussion while he was actively building that case in front of anyone paying close enough attention. Hardcore MMA fans have known for a long time what he was. The broader conversation is still catching up. That catching up is probably going to continue for years, and the debate about exactly where he sits relative to fighters like Anderson Silva, George St. Pierre, and John Jones is one of the more genuinely interesting arguments serious fight fans can have. It does not have a single clean answer, and that is not a problem. The most interesting careers rarely do. What is clear is that Demetrious Johnson was one of the finest fighters of his generation, that his title reign produced some of the most technically impressive championship performances in MMA history, and that the gap between what he was and how loudly the world celebrated it tells you almost as much about MMA's relationship with its lighter weight classes as it does about him. Now that is the full story of Demetrious Mighty Mouse Johnson. Now I want to know, where do you land on this whole debate? When you look at 11 consecutive UFC title defenses, the technical brilliance, the records that he broke, and the way that he just kept competing at a high level, even after leaving the UFC, do you put him at the top of the list of the all-time MMA greats? Or does the weight class, the drawing power, or the way the UFC run kind of ended change where you put him? Now I want to know your thoughts down in the comments down below, and also drop a name for a fighter that you want to see in one of our next videos. Now since you made it till the end, give this video a like and also subscribe to the channel and check out the videos that are popping up the screen right now, and I will catch you on the next one.